Hi guys, this is Adnan.
This is Tanzala.
Another book on our list for 2020 is The Universe of Voss by Leav. It's a book of poetry. It's a fantastic book of poetry, and it's a pretty quick read. I mean, I guess you could do it in...
I read it in a day.
Half a day, a day if you set your mind to it.
I think Adnan gave it to me one night, and I got home and I read it until like 2 a.m. and I finished it.
Yeah, it's a very riveting book as well. It's a lot about... deals with a lot of like love, loss, relationships. There were a lot of very wise verses within that book. I truly enjoyed it, and I think it's made me want to pursue more of Leav's work as well.
Was this the first time you reading Leav's work?
This is the first time I read a work from Leav, but this was the second book I've come across. So the first book I came across was... I don't remember the name right now, but my mom basically introduced me to Leav. So she has a book by Leav. I came across it a few years ago, and I never actually bothered picking it up. I think in hindsight I should have, because it was literally like, sitting in front of me for years on end. But this is the first time I've actually picked up a book from Leav and read it. And she has a lot more work. She's renowned the world over. She's a prolific poet, and I would definitely recommend that book for some good, both deep but also quick reading.
Yes, quick reading. And I think her poetry book focuses on, this one in specific focuses on kind of cosmic parts of the universe, and it has like a lot of connotations to planets and galaxies and stars and so forth, and she draws inspiration. And I just wanted to read just like the first passage of her book, because I think it's so beautifully written, and just wanted to give you a taste of like her poetry. Okay, so this is like the introduction, and she basically says, I believe we think more deeply about the universe when we're falling in love. I think the mysterious pull that draws you to another person is identical to the one that moves our eyes upward to the stars. The Universe of Us is my fourth book. As a child, I always loved the romance of the night sky. While writing this new body of work, I revisit that sense of wonder and fascination that I've held as far back as I can remember. The sentiment can be best described as a mixture of nostalgia and longing. In many ways, a book is, in itself, a tiny universe. Each page is like a newly formed galaxy, fashioned from a single pulsing thought. A book travels for days, for years, sometimes for centuries, to meet you at an exact point in time. I hope you enjoy The Universe of Us as much as I've enjoyed putting it together. I like to think it has found you for a reason, even if that reason is only to draw your eyes upwards, skyward, once more.
Every page is like a universe, isn't it?
At that part, when she said that, it like really spoke to me, because I hold books to such a high regard as well. It's like people have taken the time to write their lives and their experiences and condense it into like 500 pages, and it really is like a whole lifetime if you think about it, in like a hardcover book for us to digest. So the next book is not one we read together, but he is in the process of finishing it.
50 pages in.
50 pages in, so you can add your input. So this is called Shoe Dog by Phil Knight. And so Phil Knight, for those who don't know, he is the creator and mastermind behind Nike. And this book, it's kind of a rags to riches story, and it's a very, I think, transparent and humble reminder of what it takes to reach success. And I think Phil Knight is an amazing storyteller. When I first picked up this book and started reading it, I half expected it to just be a very corporate book. A book about, how to get from point A to point B using these tactics and so forth, and, him patting himself on the back for the success he's achieved. But what it turned out to be is not that at all. I think he explained his story in a way that shows that he took chances. He went against what a lot of common notions and perceptions and what his family was saying. He went against his fears and went outside of his comfort zone, and really he lived life on his own terms, and that's actually what I took away from it. And it just talked about so much about his like perseverance and grit and not taking no for an answer. Like, for example, he was a trailblazer in the sense that when he traveled from America to Japan to see through his idea and find suppliers for a shoe that he wanted to import to US. This was during a backdrop of just the world recovering from World War II, and tensions were high with Japan still and Americans, and he threw caution to the wind and took a huge risk, and he went to Japan and met with suppliers there. And after he went to Japan, he did a whole tour of the world because he had this deep desire to see the world, and he didn't want to come back home. He wanted to do something different. He wanted his life to mean more. And he's very vulnerable in this book, and he goes into great depth and detail about his family and his life and his role models, and very, very illuminating to read about his childhood and growing up and his thought process. And we see him from his early ages, or hear his thoughts from early ages of his early 20s all the way to many years later, when he finally makes his company public, and overnight he's worth I think $179 million. So he talks about the entire span of his journey.
He's very introspective. He's very meditative. Whatever I've read the book so far, and it's something that Tan's highly recommended. So I am, as I said, a few dozen pages in. But from what I gather, he's not lacking for ambition. Even from his days in college, he's definitely a trailblazer. He's quite spiritual.
Yes,
very worldly. Visited a lot of countries early in his career, which kind of I believe had a formative impact on his mindset and where he was heading. The book is so vivid in its descriptions of the places that he's visiting. Whether it's Istanbul, whether it's Bombay, whether it's Cairo, whether it's Tokyo or Kobe, I don't recall, but it shows the people inhabiting those cityscapes, the people he comes into contact with, him visiting these famous monuments, or musing on these famous luminaries from history like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and so on.
The goddess of Nike.
Exactly. The goddess of victory. Yeah,
Sorry,
exactly.
The goddess of victory.
Nike, the goddess
Nike,
of victory. So basically the namesake for the brand, and it really it gives you a peek into his mindset. He's not one of those boilerplate run-of-the-mill founders who, while good and successful, you don't really hear about. You kind of see what kind of propelled him further on. He was always drawn in by other cultures, other people, other stories.
Exactly.
And
this drive, right? He was, and he repeats this throughout the book. He's like, I wanted to win so badly. Actually, I was just scared to hell of losing. Yeah, exactly. And one thing that I already garnered from whatever I read so far is, and he articulates this as well, he's very afraid of mediocrity. Yes. He is fearful of mediocrity. He will run from that there's no tomorrow. He says, my biggest fear is, what if I'm stuck here forever selling encyclopedias or selling mutual funds? Being born in Oregon, right, where nothing much happens. He just didn't want that for his life. And that's another thing when you mention all that traveling. I didn't expect the book to further fuel my wanderlust, which it totally did. I'm like, man, what am I doing? Obviously, right now it's different. I was like, why didn't this book come to me 3 years ago, 4 years ago? It's just, I wanted to just pick my bags up and just travel the world and not look back for a year or whatever. So, no, it's a highly. Well, that'll happen someday. Don't worry. Hopefully sooner rather than later. Sooner rather than later. So it's a book about just perseverance, grit, never taking no for an answer. Phil just goes through several hardships throughout the book, and for example, just his supply, the conservative banks not giving him a loan until he has to go through several channels to finally, secure one, and then 2 banks dropping him as a customer, and his suppliers going behind his back, and looking at other distributors in the U.S. and planning to, cut his, company from their products, and also different competitors trying to sue him, and a showdown with the U.S. government. So he went through so many different obstacles, and which, anyone, who wasn't as driven as him would have thought to themselves, okay, great, this is a sign that I just need to back away. This is not meant for me. Obviously this is more trouble than it's worth. It's a headache, and, I'm gonna try something else. But so it kind of, I think reading that, you have to believe in your idea to the point where it's a bit crazy.
Yeah.
I think this is what another thing that I've noticed.
It's a bit ludicrous.
Like hearing his like thought process, he is very like risky, and he also is a bit like, like at all costs.
Willing to gamble it all.
Willing to gamble it all.
You need that mindset to a large extent.
Yeah.
I mean, the biggest success stories, overnight, well, quote unquote overnight success stories are not really overnight, but the biggest stories you hear about are people who put everything on the line, like success at any cost, right? And that can be both good or bad. It really depends. But there's a huge element of risk taking in any venture. Things won't come to you easily. No matter how well connected you might be, no matter how well resourced you might be. I mean, you hear of like Fortune 500 companies failing in new ventures and exiting entire industries because they thought they knew better. It turns out they didn't, because some agile disruptor came in and kind of upended their business model or whatever the case might be. So yeah, you definitely need some of that mindset if you want to be like a thriving entrepreneur, especially in this economy and in where we are right now. This book holds a lot of lessons for budding entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs out there, that this is the grit it takes.
Exactly.
Pound the pavement, get things done, and yeah.
Yeah,
can't wait to finish the rest of the book.
Finland is not only a businessman, he's a life man, for lack of a better word. So I think you'll get a very well-rounded picture of what it takes to succeed in the business world, and also a few, lessons and wisdom to take along the way. So highly recommend this book. The next book that I have on my list is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. And Chris Voss is a former FBI hostage negotiator. So he, I think, knows a thing or two about negotiating, and in this book he kind of teaches the common man how to go about negotiating and getting what they want in an environment such as that. Chris Voss recounts exactly how he brought down and cooled down situations, high-stakes situations, such as with kidnappers, terrorists, and so forth, and what his mindset was. And in the beginning of each chapter, he breaks down a very critical scenario, a high-stakes, suspenseful scenario, which he had to tackle. And then, in the latter half of the chapter, he talks about the, kind of the techniques he used, and then talks about like the real world scenarios and the more common scenarios for us, and how we may be able to implement the lessons he used in these hostage negotiations and so forth. So there's I think about 9 techniques in the book, and he goes into great detail. It's a quick read as well. It's about 200 pages, but it is very illuminating, and I think one of the last things I want to mention about the book is that he kind of has this idea, and Chris Voss states that almost everything in life is a negotiation, from buying a house, buying a car, renegotiating a salary, sometimes like talking with your partner, and so many other things in life, they're a negotiation. And if you want to be successful or get something out of life, and get something better out of life, then you should learn that. I think it's a crucial skill.
Yeah, I think it's a critical skill. Yeah, it's a lot like what Yuval Noah Harari says in his book, right? Like everything about humans is about myth and storytelling, and I think that's true. Everything in life is a negotiation. And I think this was one of the first books you read during lockdown, right?
It was I think one of the first one. I think
the very first.
Yeah, I think it may be the very first.
Yeah.
The first one, and I read it on Scribd.com.
Yeah,
last May or June. Yeah, one of the very first books I read. But it was one of my favorites. I finished in 3 days or 2 days because I just couldn't put it down. To be successful, you need to have a certain level of communication and emotional intelligence.
Very much so.
And I think we all
possibly the most important skill.
It's not even hard skills. It's not even hard skills.
It's always soft skills. EQ.
Storytelling, again. Storytelling. And Chris Voss highlights one major thing, and I stand behind 100%, is to be an active listener. And to repeat back people's thoughts and kind of disarm them in that sense, and then after you made a connection, then to talk about your point. I think a lot of the times we've kind of lost that listening ability to an extent. A lot of people have, and we speak to respond, not to listen. So I think that's also another thing that Chris Voss kind of debunks.
So for my section of the video, I've decided to keep it as concise as possible. I was actually just talking to Tans, and she outlined this as well. I read a ton of books this year, and it's very hard to pinpoint my favorites because I read close to 40 books this year, and I probably loved at least half of them, like minimum half of them. I would say at least 18 or 20 of those titles, and it's so hard to condense all of that in like one video. But you know, for reference, if you look at some of the videos I put out earlier, namely my reading list rundown for the months of October and December, you'll get a sense of what books were my favorites for 2020, and I kind of explained them in brief in those videos itself. So that's probably the best way to go about it. But I'll do a quick rundown right here itself, and I'll work backwards. So the most recent one is The Education of an Idealist by Samantha Power, and she is the former United States ambassador to the United Nations under President Obama. So it's basically going back to her childhood in Ireland and how she migrated to the US with her mother and younger brother, complications with her father, and that relationship, and how she kind of grew up, and her journey through school, through acclimatizing herself to a new culture, essentially, because when you're moving from Ireland to the US, it is quite different. Her time in college, her time as a war correspondent, and then becoming a human rights activist, and then eventually being tapped by President Obama to, essentially assume the mantle of ambassador to the United Nations, and also how she met President Obama. The two of them had a very close relationship, and that endured over the years. So it's a very eye-opening look into the life of a key Obama administration official, and someone whose influence still reverberates to this day. The next one is The Priory of the Orange Tree. That is a fantasy book set in a fantasy world, so to speak. I'm a big fan of fantasy, and
now the fiction comes out.
And I have to say, this is probably one of the best books I've read in years. Not one of the best fantasy books I've read in years, not one of the best fiction books I've read in years. There were literally moments where I had to put this book down and go out for a walk, take a deep breath, and come back and continue reading. It is so powerful. It was so thought-provoking on so many levels. It spoke to so many things about conflict and economies and human rights and LGBTQ rights, and religion. Religion was a big part of it as well, and this was definitely one of my favorite titles from this year. And even if you're not a fan of fantasy, I would highly recommend that book. Not the easiest read. It is something close to 900 pages, and remember I told you it might take me a month to read that?
Mm-hmm.
It took me a week.
Yeah, I was not surprised.
And that was definitely one of the best. It's one of the best books I've read in the last few years.
Do you think it explored parallel themes to Dune? Because you mentioned that Dune also explores a lot of those important.
To an extent, not a whole lot of overlap, because that's a really nuanced discussion. Dune, science fiction,
yeah.
And this one's pure fantasy. I feel Dune hits you more on the cerebral level. Whereas this one was probably a bit more visceral. Yeah, this one's probably a bit more visceral. They're both very intellectual reads, and obviously looking forward to Dune coming out later this year. But this book really hits you hard in all the right ways, and it really makes you question relationships and religion and how we treat people around us, and themes around prejudice and social justice to an extent, and all that. The next two books are titles that I brought up before in one of my videos. So The Deep and Indian Horse. So The Deep is, again, it's part history, part fiction, part fantasy. It basically dwells on this underwater nation that has come about as a result of a very harrowing time in our history, basically the transatlantic slave trade, and pregnant African slaves who were thrown overboard by slavers on the long journey from Africa to the New World, and essentially that was the provenance of this underwater nation. They are basically the offspring of these women, and it basically revolves around a character who acts as the keeper of history for this community. So she has been entrusted with the collective memories of this community. So she feels their trauma, their pain, their anguish, and so on. And so in a bit to like move on with her life, she tries to, break free from the shackles of her community and escape to the surface. It's a bit of a complicated read. Obviously, it's a lot more nuanced. I can't articulate everything in one video, but I would highly recommend that book. And it's not that long either. It's fairly short. Like you could finish it in a couple of days if you just like sat down and went through it. But that was an amazing one. Indian Horse is a book by Canadian novelist Richard Wagamese, and it's really, it's a fictional setting. It's a novel told from the perspective of the protagonist, Saul Indian Horse. And it's literally an expose of what goes on in our country every day that very few people are privy to. The marginalization and the prejudice against First Nations and other indigenous communities. And I suppose it goes on in many other parts of the world as well. It's not purely restricted to Canada.
But everyone thinks that like Canada is like a safe haven where there's like no racism.
Yeah, the supposed utopia that's racism free. Complete myth. A lot of myths have been shadowed, I guess, in 2020.
There's like a theme of myths being shadowed.
Yeah. We've always, the two of us, we've always known this is an issue in Canada and beyond, but, seeing it in the form of a printed word, seeing it in the form of a book or a booklet or an article, whatever the case might be, it really hits you, and it reminds you of where we are and where we need to be, that we need to further evolve as a society, and the fact that we are treating the original inhabitants of this land that way. It's completely unforgivable. It's a very gripping read. It's a very good novel. It's one of the best, one of the best books I've read this year. And if you get a chance, I'd suggest go and get it. And maybe further down the line I might review it, but that was an amazing book. Another book that's long been on my list is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. It's obviously considered a classic of the 20th century, and it was made into a film by Steven Spielberg featuring Oprah Winfrey and Whoopi Goldberg in the late 80s. And I've been meaning to read this book for the longest time. I think it's probably been a decade at this point. Like, this might be one of those books that's been on my reading list for the longest time. Like, very long. I was like long overdue, and I finally got a chance to read it. Very gripping book. Somewhat harrowing in some places, but that's what really makes it endearing. That's what really makes it one of the great American novels and a lingering classic that will stand the test of time. So I'd strongly suggest reading that book as well. Another book was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Anna Quindlen, and that's a book that apparently, it's a very renowned and globally acclaimed book. And it's been around for several decades. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was written in the earlier part of the 20th century. I only heard about it in 2019, actually. And it's been on my list since then. And it's basically the story of a family living in the midst of crippling poverty during the turn of the century in Brooklyn, as the title suggests. And how the protagonist, namely the elder daughter of the family, kind of extricates herself from that situation along with her mom and her younger brother, and they kind of set out to build a better life for themselves. So it's a very gripping read, and it's very eye-opening. Gives you a sense of how life was in New York back then. Wasn't all daisies and roses back then, as some people would believe. Even though I guess America was kind of going through the Gilded Age at that point. It was a fun read as well. It was a fun read. It was an eye-opening read. A lot of themes around family and loyalty and relationships, and struggling in the midst of like crippling penury. The final book, although I feel I'm missing quite a few, but the final book for the list would be The Dutch House, and I think that was one of the first books I read when lockdown hit all of us. Heard about it for quite a while. It was on a lot of bestseller lists, and a lot of reviewers and critics were talking about it. It's basically the story of two siblings in Philadelphia who grow up, in the midst of affluence. They have a very rich father who gives them everything that they would want in life, and basically they go from that. So it's the opposite of rags to riches. It's riches to rags to somewhat riches again by the end of the book. But it's a it was a very telling story of the bond and the relationship between two siblings. You know, it follows them from childhood all the way to, you know, unfortunately, the older sister's death and the younger brother's family, and, you know, how his children further, you know, grow up and become even more successful than he is, and they end up buying his ancestral home where he grew up, this huge sprawling mansion in Philadelphia. So the story kind of comes full circle. I got strong This Is Us vibes from this book.
I was just about to think about
very strong This Is Us vibes. I was reading the book, and that's the show that I was thinking about. And I was thinking specifically
talk about like intergenerational success.
Exactly.
Right?
And I was thinking specifically about Kate, Kevin, and Randall. Specifically Kate and Kevin. And you know how they came up and what they went through. Not so much the affluence and, you know, growing up you know, surrounded by wealth and gold and all that stuff, but also
raising
each other
and then Kevin eventually buying the house that they grew up in, right?
Kind of.
And building, and him having that affluence as well, and building a huge home where his dad kind of built theirs. Another
book that I really had to take strong breaths for. Like, I had to put it down, go out for a walk, come back, and then continue reading, because it was, even though it's so gripping, but you cannot read it in one go without feeling like all kinds of things.
I think Catch and Kill was also like that.
Oh, very much so. Oh, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, Catch and Kill. So as Stan said, trigger warning. Yeah, be careful. Read it for sure. Get out right now, get it. But
we both had to take like multiple breaks before finishing it. Like, there's some parts where you just read it and you're so, like, I think traumatized and like depressed at the world. You're like, okay, I gotta step aside for a little bit.
I mean, 2020 has been fantastic for both of us in terms of reading, in terms of volume, in terms of breadth, in terms of scope, in terms of reading a more diverse array of books and a more diverse array of authors. Obviously aided and in great part by what all of us are undergoing right now in terms of what's happening in the world.
Hope to reach 38 books this year. I doubt it, but you know,
you should try.
I don't.
You could.
I'm good, but we'll definitely we'll read more, and looking forward to what else like 2021 has to bring. And we wish you all, you know, a safe 2021, a happy one.